We turn then to Bion's article on the Caesura, and Bion simultaneously transfers in it a holistic mindset and several separate themes. I will try to talk about the main themes that Bion transmits in this article. I think the main part of the article talks about how to overcome the Caesura between verbal, formulated, conscious and elevated parts, and between preverbal, pre-formulated, primary, immature and pre-conscious parts. Perhaps even how to overcome the Caesura between the finite and the infinite. That is, how verbal therapeutic dialogue, how interpretation, how verbal intervention can go through and penetrate the verbal part of the patient and cause a real change in the patient's actual personality, in the preverbal parts of the personality. Bion also inquires about the opposite direction. How is it possible that preverbal, uterine parts can cross a Caesura and be conceived, represented and formulated in our consciousness correctly? This can be called a mentalization challenge. It's not just about parts that are traumatic, that experienced a pre-formulated trauma we want to formulate. Bion refers many times to the domain of intuition. He calls it fetal intuition. Like a very ancient intuition that is not yet formulated and can suddenly cross through, be conceived and influence the session. It reminds me of what I mentioned in another class in the context of Moses and Aaron. A part of us that knows, that is connected, but doesn't have the words for it. Is it possible to stay or be with it in a way that allows it to emerge, take form, until it can work its way into our consciousness as a formulated idea? Bion, for example, writes in the article Caesura that a baby in the nursery is not afraid of noises that often scare adults. For example, a closing door does not wake the baby. On the other hand, you can see that the baby suddenly gets scared and wakes up from something that adults don't notice. Precisely those parts that wake the baby up, Bion calls us to be attentive to in the treatment room. If a certain shock, intuition, sensation or memory passes through us, give it a lot of validity. Do not cancel it with an adult voice that says, "No, this is not relevant, we must remain attentive to content and be rational." Bion wants us to be attentive as possible to that fetal intuition. It is like connecting with the fetus that is inside us, in us, that is totally exposed and feels everything. Another theme in the article deals with the difficulty of bearing contact with reality that always exceeds our ability to know it. Not only this, but a reality that is constantly evolving in a state of emergence. The patient and the therapist are in emergence at all times. It is not that there is a measuring tool, like a stable microscope, that can objectively evaluate an inanimate phenomenon and one can be sure of its stability and scientifically evaluate something that changes. Here, the measurement tool, the therapist, is in motion, evolving. He himself is an unknown entity, and he investigates or tries to investigate another unknown entity that is also constantly emerging. I want to read one or two quotes from Bion related to the topic. What makes the venture of analysis difficult is that one constantly changing personality talks to another. I jump ahead, he writes. To distort that experience in order to make it fit into such capacities as we have is a dangerous thing. The total situation that presents itself to us is beyond our capacity. To limit ourselves to the observation only of what we understand is denying ourselves the raw material on which present and possibly future wisdom and knowledge might depend. The fact that it is incomprehensible now because our minds are unsuitable or ill-fitted to grasp it is not a reason for limiting the facts as are actually available. It is a very serious demand based on the tension between K and O. In spite of the limitations of our mind, in spite of the K-plane, in spite of our limited apparatus, we have to try and somehow be in contact with O, with something that is wide, and accompany the process of O, even if we don't know and can't positively know what it is and what we are doing. Another topic related to the same issue deals with causality and what can be called a collapse of causality or collapse towards causal explanation. Causality is something that tempts the mind greatly, especially the psychological mind. Causality says you behave like this because in the past this or that thing happened to you. Today you are depressed because, let's say, you experienced abandonment at an early age, etc., etc. Many psychological theories of development are based on the locus of causality. Things that happened in early childhood influence in this or that way today. Causality is not problematic. The problem is the collapse to a premature, ready-made causal explanation. That is to say, if the patient speaks and the therapist feels a demanding tension to grant him something, or tension to assure himself, the therapist, that he knows what's happening, he might collapse into a premature, explanatory, interpretive intervention. That is, it is difficult to explain something, it is difficult to contain the tension or the patient's demand, so the therapist says, yes, you're angry with me now because your father abandoned you at a certain age and you transfer this anger to me. It is not that this explanation is not correct. Perhaps it is correct, but the question is whether there was a defensive collapse to a pre-existing explanation that reflects an inability to withstand the Caesura, or whether the explanation is born of a creative process and finds its way at the present moment. That is a difference. Bion writes that the tendency to hold on to a causality can be defensive and might reflect a collapse. He writes it first of all in the context of the patient. Bion writes, some patients repeatedly state that they have some particular experience and then give the reason why. This continued repetition suggests a state of mind which is proper to a person who only lives in a causal world. But the only world in which causes can be said to be a prominent feature in is the world of things, not the world of people. The patient who is always telling us that he feels such and such because is avoiding a particular relationship which exists between one character and another. In other words, the patient uses the explanation because as a certain defense or intellectualization and cannot bear the unique connection and the unique moment that exists here and now. It stays defensively in the zone of transformations in K, instead of approaching the possibility of transformations in O, to avoid the risk of approaching what Bion calls a catastrophic change. What is right for the patient is also right for us, therapists. Also, a therapist who collapses all the time to causal explanations, to because, can do so at the price of avoiding unique relationships in the present moment. Another issue that Bion talks about related to the issue of causality is the schematic psychologistic use of professional jargon words. Psychotic, neurotic, borderline, narcissistic, all of this. Bion warns us that this way of speaking may reflect a collapse. He asks, is it possible not to collapse to this type of dialogue motivated by a false sensation that this dialogue explains something or that it gives us something? How is it possible to use our speech and concepts in a creative way and not in a way that catalogs and closes. Getting close to the end, I hope that this class on the topic of Caesura will evoke interest and curiosity about this concept. The concept of Caesura is a creative fountain for further developments. At the end of the article, Bion admits that he is only at the beginning of his research regarding the Caesura. He suggests other professionals investigate the Caesura, not the analyst, not the analysand, not the unconscious, not the conscious, not sanity, not insanity, but the Caesura, the link, the synapse. And he also writes, an analyst reading this paper must be able to forget it, to dismiss it from his mind, unless something is said by the analysand which calls it into his consciousness and causes him then to formulate it in such language as he is able to use. That is, take everything, but do not store it as knowledge, but as inspiration that at some point your unconscious internal creative process will naturally use in ways that are inherent to your own natural personal style. I want to end by reading a part of the poem Cantares by Antonio Machado. All things pass, all things remain, but for us we pass. On our way making paths over the sea. Wanderer, there is no path. You make the path as you walk.